At last, when he finds his voice, it sounds younger than his years, and dismayingly equivocal. I don't know, PJ. I don't know. You hold my life in your hands, Joey. I'm all mixed up. Mom and Dad in your hands. But she's dead, PJ. The girl is dead. That's right. Dead. And we're alive. But what will you do with the body? When he hears himself ask that question, Joey knows that PJ has won. He feels suddenly weak, as if he is a small child again, and he is ashamed of his weakness. Bitter remorse floods him, as corrosively painful as an acid, and he can deal with the agony only by shutting down a part of his mind, switching off his emotions. A grayness, like a fall of ashes from a great fire, sifts down through his soul. PJ says, easy. I could dump the body somewhere it'll never be found. You can't do that to her family. They can't spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened to her. They won't ever have any hope of peace if they think she's somewhere in pain, lost. You're right. Okay. I'm not myself. Obviously, I should leave her where she can be found. The internal grayness, sifting, gradually anesthetizes Joey. Minute by minute, he feels less, thinks less. This strange detachment is vaguely disturbing on one level, but it is also a great blessing, and he embraces it. Aware of a new flatness in his voice, Joey says, but then the cops might find your fingerprints on the tarp, or find something else like some of your hair. Lots of ways they might connect you to her. Don't worry about fingerprints. There aren't any to find. I've been careful. There's no other evidence either. None. No connections except... Joey waits with bleak resignation for his brother, his only and much-loved brother, to finish that thought, because he senses that it will be the worst thing with which he has to deal, the hardest thing he will have to accept, other than the discovery of the brutalized body itself. Except I knew her, says PJ. You knew her? I dated her. When? Joey asks numbly. But he is almost beyond caring. Soon the deepening grayness in him will soften all the sharp edges of his curiosity and his conscience. My senior year in high school. What's her name? A girl from Coal Valley. You didn't know her. The rain seems as if it might never end, and Joey has no doubt that the night will go on forever. PJ says, I only dated her twice. We didn't hit it off, but you can see, Joey, how this will look to the cops. I take her body to the sheriff. They find out I knew her. They'll use that against me. It'll be that much harder to prove I'm innocent, that much worse for Mom and Dad and all of us. I'm between a rock and a hard place, Joey. Yes. You see what I mean? Yes. You see how it is? Yes. I love you, little brother. I know. I was sure you'd be there for me when it counted. All right. Deep grayness. Soothing grayness. You and me, kid. Nothing in the world is stronger than you and me if we stick together. We have this bond, brothers, and it's stronger than steel, you know? Stronger than anything. It's the most important thing in the world to me, what we have together, how we've always hung in there. Brothers. They sit in silence for a while. Beyond the streaming windows of the car, the mountain darkness is deeper than it has ever been before, as if the highest ridges have tilted toward one another, fusing together, blocking out the narrow band of sky and any hope of stars, as if he and PJ and Mom and Dad now exist in a stone vault without doors or windows. "You've got to be getting back to college soon," PJ says. "You've got a long drive tonight." "Yeah. I've got a long one, too." Joey nods. "You'll have to come visit me in New York." Joey nods. "The Big Apple," PJ says. "Yeah." "We'll have some fun." "Yeah." "Here, I want you to have this," PJ says, taking Joey's hand, trying to push something into it. "What?" "A little extra spending money." "I don't want it," Joey says, trying to pull away. PJ grips his hand tightly, forcing a wad of bills between his reluctant fingers. "No, I want you to have it. I know how it is in college. You can always use a little extra." Joey finally wrenches away without accepting the bills. PJ is relentless. He tries to shove the money into Joey's coat pocket. "Come on, kid. It's only $30. It's not a fortune. It's nothing. Humor me. Let me play the big shot. I never get to do anything for you. It'll make me feel good." Resistance is so difficult and seems so pointless. Only $30, an insignificant sum that Joey finally lets his brother put the money in his pocket. He is worn out. He hasn't the energy to resist. PJ pats him on the shoulder affectionately. "Better go inside, get you packed up and off to school." They return to the house. Their folks are curious. Dad says, "Hey, did I raise a couple of sons who are too dumb to come in out of the rain?" Putting an arm around Joey's shoulder, PJ says, "Just some brother talk, Dad. Big brother, little brother stuff, meaning of life, all that." With a smile, Mom teasingly says, "Deep, dark secrets." Joey's love for her at that moment is so intense, so powerful, that the force of it almost drives him to his knees. In desperation, he retreats deeper into an internal grayness, and all the bright hurts of the world are dimmed, all the sharpness dulled. He packs quickly and leaves a few minutes before PJ. Of all the goodbye hugs that he receives, the one from his brother is the most all-encompassing, the most fierce. A couple miles outside of Asherville, he becomes aware of a car closing rapidly behind him. By the time he reaches the stop sign at the intersection of the county route and Coal Valley Road, the other vehicle has caught up with him. The driver doesn't stop behind Joey, but swings around him, casting up great sheets of dirty water, and takes the turn onto Coal Valley Road at too high a speed. When the tire-thrown water washes off the windshield, Joey sees that the car has stopped after traveling 100 yards onto the other highway. He knows it is PJ, waiting. It isn't too late. There is still world enough and time. Everything hinges on making a left-hand turn. That is the route he had intended to take anyway. Just turn left, as planned, and do what must be done. Red taillights, beacons in the dismal rain, waiting. Joey drives through the intersection straight ahead, passing the turnoff to Coal Valley, taking the county route all the way to the interstate. And on the interstate, although he still invites the devil of detachment into his heart, he can't prevent himself from recalling certain things that PJ said, statements that have a more profound meaning now than they'd had earlier. "It's so easy to destroy me, Joey, but even easier just to believe." As if truth were not an objective view of the facts, as if it could be whatever a person chose to believe. And don't worry about fingerprints. There aren't any to be found. I've been careful. Caution implied intent. A frightened, confused, innocent man wasn't rational enough to be cautious. He didn't take steps to ensure that he eradicated all the evidence linking him to a crime. Had there been any bearded man with greasy hair, or had that been a Charles Manson-inspired convenience? If he'd hit the woman up on Pine Ridge, hit her hard enough to kill her instantly, why wasn't his car damaged? Southbound in the night, Joey becomes increasingly distraught, and he drives faster, 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 as though he believes that he can outrun all the facts and their dark implications. Then he finds the jar, loses control of the Mustang, spins out, crashes, and finds himself standing by the guardrail, staring out at a field full of knee-high grass and taller weeds, not quite sure what he's doing there, wind howling down the interstate with a sound like legions of phantom trucks hauling strange cargo. Sleet stings his face, his hands. Blood, a cut above his right eye, A head injury. He touches the wound and a brightness spirals behind his eyes, brief, hot fireworks of pain. A head injury. Even one as small as this provides infinite possibilities, not the least of which is amnesia. Memory can be a curse and a guarantee against happiness. On the other hand, forgetfulness can be a blessing, and it can even be mistaken for that most admirable of all virtues, forgiveness. He returns to the car. He drives to the nearest hospital to have his bleeding wound stitched. He's going to be all right. He is going to be all right. At college again, he attends classes for 2 days, but he finds no value in following the narrow highways of formal education. He is a natural autodidact anyway, and he will never find a teacher as demanding of him as he is of himself. Besides, if he is going to be a writer or novelist, then he needs to acquire a fund of real-world experiences from which to draw upon for the creation of his art. The stultifying atmosphere of classrooms and the outdated wisdom of textbooks will only inhibit development of his talent and stifle his creativity. He needs to venture far and wide, leave academia behind, and plunge into the turbulent river of life. He packs his things and leaves college forever. 2 days later, somewhere in Ohio, he sells the damaged Mustang to a used car dealer, and thereafter he hitchhikes west. 10 days after leaving college from a desert truck stop in Utah, he drops a postcard to his parents, explaining his decision to begin the experience-gathering process that will give him the material he needs to be a writer. He tells them that they should not worry about him, that he knows what he's doing, that he'll keep in touch. He's going to be all right. He's going to be all right. He tells them that they should not worry about him, that he knows what he's doing, that he'll keep in touch. He's going to be all right. He's going to be all right. Of course, Joey said, still kneeling beside the dead woman in the deconsecrated church. I was never all right again. The rain on the roof was a mournful sound like a dirge for her, the doubly dead, in that she'd died so young. Joey said, I drifted from place to place, job to job, fell out of touch with everyone, even with the dream of becoming a writer. I was too busy for dreams, too busy playing the game of amnesia, didn't dare see Mom and Dad, and risk coming apart, spilling the truth. Turning away from the deserted nave over which he had been keeping watch, returning to his side, Celeste said, Maybe you're being too hard on yourself. Maybe the amnesia wasn't just self-delusion. The head injury could explain it. I wish I was able to believe that, Joey said, but the truth is subjective, not just what we'd like to make it. 2 things I don't understand. If there are only 2, then you're way ahead of me. In the car with PJ that night. Tonight. It was 20 years ago, but also just tonight. He'd already convinced you to believe him, or at least to go along and get along. Then after he had you in the palm of his hand, he told you he knew the dead girl. Why would he make a revelation like that when he'd already won? Why would he risk raising your suspicions again and losing you? You had to know PJ well to understand. There was always this dangerous quality about him. Not recklessness, not anything that anyone found truly scary in any way. Just the opposite. It added to his allure. It was a wonderful, romantic sort of dangerousness, a thing that people admired. He liked to take chances. It was most obvious on the football field. His maneuvers were often so bold and unorthodox, but they worked. They always said he liked to play on the edge. Yeah, and he enjoyed driving fast, really fast. But he could handle a car about as well as anyone in the Indy 500, never had an accident or traffic ticket. In a poker game, he'd bet everything he had on a single hand, even a bad one if the timing felt right to him, and he nearly always won. You can live dangerously almost to any extreme, and as long as you win, as long as the risks you take pay off, then people admire you for it. Standing over him, she put her hand on his shoulder. I guess that also explains the other thing I didn't understand. The jar in the glove box, he guessed. Yeah. I'm assuming he put it there while you were packing your bags to go to college. He must have cut out her eyes earlier in the day, kept them as a memento, for God's sake. I'm sure he thought it would be funny to put them in my car and let me find them later, test the strength of our bond. After he'd convinced you he was innocent, persuaded you to let him dispose of the body, he was crazy ever to let you see the eyes, let alone give them to you. He couldn't resist the thrill, the danger, walking that thin line along the edge of disaster. And you see, he pulled it off again. He got away with it. I let him win. He acts like he thinks he's blessed. Maybe he is, Joey said. By what God? There's no God involved. Celeste stepped past him onto the altar platform, moved to the far side of the dead woman, pocketed the screwdriver and flashlight, and knelt. Facing him across the body, she said, "We have to look at her face." Joey grimaced. Why? PJ didn't tell you her name, but he said she's from here in Coal Valley. I probably know her. That'll make it even harder on you. There's no choice but to look, Joey, she persisted. If we know who she is, we might have a clue about what he's up to, where he's gone. They found it necessary to roll the body on its side to pull free a loose end of the plastic tarp. They eased the dead woman onto her back again before uncovering her face. A thick fall of blood-spotted blonde hair mercifully veiled her ravid features. A thick fall of blood-spotted blonde hair mercifully veiled her ravaged features. With one hand, Celeste carefully pushed the hair aside with a tenderness that Joey found deeply touching. Simultaneously, with her other hand, she crossed herself and said, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, Amen." Joey tilted his head back and stared at the sanctuary ceiling, not because he hoped to get a glimpse of the Trinity whose names she had intoned, but because he couldn't bear to look into the empty sockets. "There's a gag in her mouth," Celeste told him. "One of those things you wash a car with, chamois. I think... Yes, her ankles are tied with wire. She wasn't running from any crazed mountain man." Joey shuddered. "Her name's Beverly Korshak," Celeste said. "She was a few years older than me, a nice girl, friendly. She still lived with her folks, but they sold out to the government here and moved into a house in Asherville last month. Beverly had a secretarial job there at the electric company office. Her folks are good friends with my folks. Known them a long, long time, Phil and Sylvie Korshak. This is going to be hard on them, real hard." Joey still stared at the ceiling. PJ must have seen her in Asherville earlier today. Stopped to chat her up. She wouldn't have hesitated to get in the car with him. He wasn't a stranger, at least not apparently. "Let's cover her," Celeste said. "You do it." He wasn't squeamish about what her eyeless face might look like. He was afraid, instead, that in her empty sockets he would somehow be able to see her blue eyes, still intact, as they had been in the last moments of her terrible agony, when she had screamed for help through the wadded rag in her mouth, and had known that no savior would answer her pleas. The plastic rustled. "You amaze me," he said. "Why?" "Your strength. I'm here to help you, that's all. I thought I was here to help you. Maybe it's both ways." The rustling stopped. "Okay," Celeste assured him. He lowered his head and saw what he first thought was blood on the floor of the altar platform. It had been revealed when they shifted the position of the corpse. On second look, however, Joey realized that it was not blood, but paint from a spray can. Someone had written the number 1 and drawn a circle around it. "You see this?" he asked Celeste, as she rose to her feet on the other side of the dead woman. "Yeah, something to do with the demolition plans." "I don't think so." "Sure, must be. Or maybe just kids vandalizing the place. They painted more of them back there," she said, gesturing in the general direction of the nave. He got up, turned, and frowned at the dimly lighted church. "Where?" "The first row of pews," she said. Against the dark wood backs of the benches, the red paint was difficult to read from a distance. After picking up the crowbar, Joey swung his legs over the presbytery balustrade, dropped into the 3-sided choir enclosure, and went to the sanctuary railing. He heard Celeste following him, but by way of the ambulatory. On the front pew to the left of the center aisle, a series of sequential numbers circled in red had been painted side by side. They were spaced approximately as people would have been if any had been sitting there. Farthest to the left was the number 2, and the last number nearest the center aisle was 6. Joey felt as though spiders were crawling on the back of his neck, but his hand found none there. On the pew to the right of the center aisle, the red numbers continued in sequence: 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, to the far side of the church. 12, he brooded. Joining him at the sanctuary railing, Celeste said softly, "What's wrong?" "The woman on the altar. Beverly." He stared intently at the red numbers on the pews, which now seemed as radiant as signs of the apocalypse. "Joey, what about her? What is it?" Joey was still puzzling it out, standing in the shadow of truth, but not quite able to see the whole icy structure of it. He painted the number 1 and then put her on top of it. PJ did? Yeah. Why? A hard blast of wind battered the old church, and a draft swept through the nave. The faintly lingering scent of stale incense and the stronger smell of mildew were swept away, and the draft brought with it the stink of sulfur. Joey said, "Do you have any brothers or sisters?" Clearly puzzled by the question, she shook her head. "No." "Does anyone else live with you and your folks, like maybe a grandparent, anyone?" "No, just the 3 of us. Beverly's one of 12. 12 what?" He pointed at Celeste, and his hand shook. "Then your family. 2, 3, 4. Who else still lives in Coal Valley?" "The Dolans." "How many of them?" 5 in their family." "Who else?" "John and Beth Bimmer. John's mother, Hannah, lives with them." 3. 3 Bimmers, 5 Dolans, plus you and your folks. 11. Plus her, there on the altar. With a sweep of his hand, he indicated the numbers on the pews. 12. Oh, God. I don't need any psychic flash to see where he's going with this one. The number 12 must appeal to him for the obvious reason. 12 apostles. All dead, and lined up in a deconsecrated church. All of them paying silent homage not to God, but to the 13th apostle. That's how PJ sees himself, I think, as the 13th apostle, Judas, the betrayer. Still holding the crowbar, he pushed open the sacristy gate and returned to the nave. He touched one of the numbers on the left-hand pew. In places, the paint was still tacky. Judas, betraying his family, Joey said. Betraying the faith he was raised in, with reverence for nothing, loyal to nothing, to no one, fearing nothing, not even God, walking the most dangerous line of them all, taking the biggest imaginable risk to get the greatest of all thrills, risking his soul for a dance along the edge of damnation. Celeste moved close to Joey, pressed against his side, needing the comfort of contact. He's setting up some sort of symbolic tableau. With corpses, Joey said. He intends to kill everyone who still lives in Coal Valley before the night is through and bring their bodies here. She paled. Did that come to pass? He didn't understand. Come to pass? In the future that you've already lived, were all the people in Coal Valley killed? With a shock, Joey realized that he didn't know the answer to her question. After that night, I pretty much stopped reading newspapers, news magazines, avoided TV news, changed stations on the radio every time a news report came on, told myself that I was burnt out on news, that it was all just airplane crashes and floods and fires and earthquakes, but what it really must have been. I didn't want to read about or hear about any women being mutilated, murdered, didn't want to risk some detail of a crime, eyes cut out, anything like that, making a subconscious connection for me and maybe blowing away my amnesia. So for all you know, it happened. For all you know, they found 12 dead people in this church, lined up on the front pews, one of them on the altar platform. If it did come to pass, if that's what they found, no one ever nailed PJ for it, because in my future he's still on the loose. Jesus. Mom and Dad. She pushed away from him and ran down the center aisle toward the back of the nave. He rushed after her through the narthex, through the open front doors into the sleety night. She slipped on the icy walkway, fell to one knee, scrambled up and hurried on, rounding the car to the passenger side. As he reached the driver's door of the Mustang, Joey heard a rumble that first seemed to be thunder, but then he realized that the sound was coming from beneath him, from under the street. Celeste looked worriedly at him from across the roof of the car. Subsidence. The rumble built. The street trembled as though a freight train were passing through a tunnel under them, and then both the shaking and the ominous sound faded away. A section of a burning mine tunnel had collapsed. Glancing around them, seeing no disturbance of the ground, Joey said, "Where?" "Must be somewhere else in town. Come on, hurry," she urged, getting into the car. Behind the wheel, starting the engine, afraid that a sudden fissure in the street might swallow the Mustang and drop them into fire, Joey said, "Subsidence, huh? I've never felt it that bad. Could be right under us, but very deep, so far down that it didn't affect the surface." Yet. Chapter 12. Even though the tires had winter tread, they spun uselessly a couple of times on the way to Celeste's place. But Joey concluded the short trip without sliding into anything. The Baker house was white with green trim and 2 dormer windows on the second floor. He and Celeste ran clumsily across the lawn to the front porch steps, avoiding the walkway, which was far more treacherous than the frozen grass. Lights glowed through the downstairs, glittering in laces of ice that filigreed some of the windows. The porch lamp was on as well. They should have entered with caution because PJ might have gotten there ahead of them. They had no way of knowing which of the 3 families he intended to visit first. But Celeste was in a panic about her folks, so she unlocked the door and plunged heedlessly into the short front hall, calling out to them as she entered. "Mom? Daddy? Where are you, Mom?" No one answered. Aware that any attempt to restrain the girl would prove futile, brandishing the crowbar at every shadow and imagined movement, Joey followed close behind her as she burst through doorways and flung open those doors that were closed, shouting for her mother and father with increasing terror. 4 rooms downstairs and 4 up, 1.5 bathrooms. The place wasn't a mansion by any definition, but it was better than any home that Joey had ever known, and everywhere there were books. Celeste checked her own bedroom last, but her parents weren't there either. "He's got them," she said frantically. "No, I don't think so. Look around you. There aren't any signs of violence here, no indications of a struggle. And I don't think they would have gone out with him anywhere willingly. Not in this weather." "Then where are they?" "If they'd had to go somewhere unexpectedly, would they leave a note for you?" Without answering, she spun around, dashed into the hall, and descended the stairs 2 at a time to the ground floor. Joey caught up with her in the kitchen where she was reading a message that was pinned to a corkboard beside the refrigerator. "Celeste, Bev didn't come home from Mass this morning. No one knows where she is. The sheriff is looking for her. We've gone over to Asherville to sit with Phil and Sylvie. They're half out of their minds with worry. I'm sure it's all going to turn out fine. Whatever happens, we'll be home before midnight. Hope you had a nice time at Linda's place. Keep the doors locked. Don't worry. Bev will turn up. God won't let anything happen to her. Love, Mom." Turning from the corkboard, Celeste glanced at the wall clock, only 9:02, and said, "Thank God. He can't get his hands on them." Hands, Joey suddenly remembered. "Let me see your hands." She held them out to him. The previously frightful stigmata in her palms had faded until they were vague bruises. "We must be making right decisions," he said with a shiver of relief. "We're changing fate. Your fate, at least. We've just got to keep on keeping on." When he looked up from her hands to her face, he saw her eyes widen at the sight of something over his shoulder. Heart leaping, he swung toward the danger, raising the iron crowbar. "No," she said, "just the telephone." She stepped to the wall phone. "We can call for help, the sheriff's office. Let them know where they can find Bev. Get them looking for PJ." The telephone was an old-fashioned rotary model. Joey hadn't seen one of those in a long time. Curiously, more than anything else, it convinced him that he was, indeed, 20 years in the past. Celeste dialed the operator, then jiggled the cradle in which the handset had been hanging. No dial tone. All this wind, ice, the lines might be down. No, it's him. He cut the lines. Joey knew that she was right. She slammed down the phone and headed out of the kitchen. "Come on, we can do better than the crowbar." In the den, she went to the oak desk and took the gun cabinet key from the center drawer. 2 walls were lined with books. Running one hand over their brightly colored spines, Joey said, "Just tonight I finally realized when PJ conned me into letting him get away with murder, he stole my future." Opening the glass door of the gun cabinet, she said, "What do you mean?" "I wanted to be a writer. That's all I ever wanted to be. But what a novelist is always trying to do, if he's any good, is trying to get at the truth of things. How could I hope to get at the truth of things to be a writer? How could I hope to get at the truth of things, be a writer, when I couldn't even face up to the truth about my brother? He left me with nowhere to go, no future, and he became the writer." She removed a shotgun from the rack in the cabinet and put it on the desk. "Remington, 20 gauge, pump action. Nice gun. So tell me something, how could he be a writer if it's supposed to be all about dealing with truth? He's only about lies and deceit. Is he a good writer?" "Everyone says he is." She took another shotgun from the cabinet and put it on the desk beside the first weapon. Remington, too. "My dad's partial to the brand, 12 gauge. Pretty walnut stock, isn't it?" "I didn't ask you what everyone else says. What do you think? Is he any good as a novelist in this future of yours?" "He's successful. So what? Doesn't necessarily mean he's good. He's won a lot of awards, and I've always pretended to think he's good, but I've really never felt he was much good at all. Crouching, pulling open a drawer in the bottom of the cabinet, quickly pawing through the contents, she said, "So tonight you take your future back, and you will be good." In one corner stood a gray metal box the size of a briefcase. It was ticking. "What's that thing in the corner?" Joey asked. "It monitors carbon monoxide and other toxic gases seeping up from the mine fires. There's one in the basement. This room isn't over the basement. It's an add-on, so it has a monitor of its own." "An alarm goes off?" "Yeah, if there's too many fumes." In the drawer she found 2 boxes of ammunition. She put them on the desk. Every house in Coal Valley was equipped with them years ago. "It's like living on a bomb." "Yeah, but with a long, slow fuse." "Why haven't you moved out?" "Bureaucrats. Paperwork. Processing delays. If you move out before the government has the papers ready to sign, then they declare the house abandoned, a public danger. And they aren't willing to pay as much for it. You have to live here, take the risk, let it happen at their pace if you want to get a halfway fair price." Opening one of the boxes of shells as Celeste opened the other, Joey said, "You know how to use these guns?" "I've been going skeet shooting and hunting with my dad since I was 13. "You don't seem like a hunter to me," he said as he loaded the 20 gauge. "Never killed anything. Always aimed to miss." "Your dad never noticed that?" "Funny thing is, whether it's shotguns or rifles, whether it's small game or deer, he always aims to miss too, though he doesn't think I know it." "Then what's the point?" As she finished loading the 12 gauge, she smiled with affection at the thought of her father. "He likes just being in the woods, walking in the woods on a crisp morning, the clean smell of the pines, and having some private time with me. He's never said, but I've always sensed he would have liked a son. Mom had complications with me, couldn't carry another baby. So I've always tried to give Dad a little of the son stuff. He thinks I'm a real tomboy." "You're amazing," he said. Hastily dropping spare shells into the various pockets of her black raincoat, she said, "I'm only what I'm here to be." The strangeness of that statement harked back to other enigmatic things that she had said earlier in the night. He met her eyes, and once again he saw those mysterious depths which seemed too profound for her years, too deep to be plumbed. She was the most interesting girl that he had ever known, and he hoped that she saw something appealing in his eyes. As Joey finished stuffing spare shells into the pockets of his sheepskin-lined denim jacket, Celeste said, "Do you think Beverly is the first?" "The first?" "That he's ever killed?" "I hope so, but I don't know." "I think there have been others," she said solemnly. "After that night, after Beverly, when I let him go. I know there must have been others. That's why he was a gypsy. Poet of the highway, my ass. He liked the life of a drifter because he could keep moving through one police jurisdiction after another. Hell, I never realized it before, didn't want to realize it, but it's the classic sociopathic pattern. The loner on the road, the outsider, a stranger everywhere he goes, the next thing to invisible. Easier for a man like that to get caught if the bodies keep piling up in the same place. PJ's brilliance was to make a profession out of drifting, to become rich and famous for it, to have the unstructured lifestyle of a rootless serial killer but with a perfect cover, a respectable occupation that all but required rootlessness, and a reputation for writing uplifting stories about love and courage and compassion. But all that's in the future as far as I'm concerned," Celeste said. "Maybe my future, our future. Or maybe only one possible future. I don't know how that works, or that it'll even help to think about it." Joey had a bitter taste in his mouth, as though biting into a hard truth could produce a flavor as acrid as chewing on dry aspirin. "Whether it was one possible future or the only future, I still have to carry some of the guilt for all those he killed after Beverly, because I could have put an end to it that night. Which is why you're here now, tonight, with me. To undo it all. Not just to save me, but everyone who came after. And to save yourself." She picked up the 12 gauge and chambered a shell. "But what I meant was that I think he's killed before Beverly. He was just too cool with you, Joey. Too smooth with that story about her running in front of his car up on Pine Ridge. If she'd been his first, he'd have been easily rattled. When you opened that trunk and found her, he'd have been more shaken. The way he handled you. He's used to carting dead women around in his car, looking for a safe place to dump them. He's had a lot of time to think about what he'd do if anyone ever caught him with a body before he was able to dispose of it." Joey suspected that she was right about this, just as she was right about the weather not being responsible for the dead telephone. No wonder he had reacted with blind panic in Henry Kodinska's office when the attorney revealed the terms of his father's last will and testament. The money in the estate had originally come from PJ. It was blood money in more ways than one, as tainted as Judas's 30 pieces of silver. Cash accepted from the devil himself could have been no less clean. He chambered a shell in his own shotgun. Let's go. Chapter 13. Outside, the sleet storm had passed, and rain was falling once more. The brittle ice on the sidewalks and in the streets was swiftly melting into slush. Joey had been wet and cold all night. In fact, he had lived in a perpetual chill for 20 years. He was used to it. Halfway along the front walk, he saw that the hood was standing open on the Mustang. By the time he got to the car, Celeste was shining the flashlight into the engine compartment. The distributor cap was gone. PJ, Joey said, having his fun. Fun? To him, it's all fun. I think he's watching us right now. Joey surveyed the nearby abandoned houses. The wind-stirred trees between them, south to the end of the next block where the street terminated and the forested hills began, north 1 block to the main drag through town. He's right here somewhere, she said uneasily. Joey agreed, but in the tumult of wind and rain, his brother's presence was even less easily detected than a reluctant spirit at a seance. Who's closer, the Dolans or the Bimmers? John and Beth Bimmer. And his mother. She nodded. Hannah. Sweet old lady. Let's hope we're not too late, Joey said. PJ can't have had time to come here from the church ahead of us, cut the phone lines, wait around to disable the car, and still go after anyone. Nevertheless, they hurried through the slush in the street. On that treacherous pavement, however, they didn't dare to run as fast as they would have liked. They had gone only half a block when the subterranean rumble began again, markedly louder than before, building swiftly until the ground quivered under them as though no boats plied the river Styx anymore, leaving the transport of all souls to deep-running, clamorous railroads. As before, the noise lasted no more than half a minute, with no catastrophic surface eruption of the seething fires below. The Bimmers lived on North Avenue, which wasn't half grand enough to be called an avenue. The pavement was severely cracked and buckled as though from a great and incessant pressure below. Even in the gloom, the once white houses appeared too drab, as if they were not merely in need of a fresh coat of paint, but were all heavily mottled with soot. Some of the evergreens were deformed, stunted, others were dead. At least North Avenue was on the north side of town, across Coal Valley Road from the Baker House and 1 block farther east. 6-foot-tall vent pipes, spaced about 60 feet on center and encircled by high chain-link safety barriers, lined one side of the street. From those flues out of realms below arose gray plumes of smoke like processions of fugitive ghosts, which were torn into rags by the wind and exorcised by the rain, leaving behind only a stink like that of hot tar. The 2-story Bimmer residence was curiously narrow for its lot, built to the compressed horizontal dimensions of a row house in a downtown neighborhood in some industrial city like Altoona or Johnston. It appeared taller than it actually was, and forbidding. Lights were on downstairs. As he and Celeste climbed the porch steps, Joey heard music inside and a tinny laugh track. Television. He pulled open the aluminum and glass storm door and knocked on the wood door behind it. In the house, the Phantom Studio audience laughed uproariously, and a light-hearted tinkle of piano music further cued the folks at home that they were supposed to be amused. After the briefest hesitation, Joey knocked again, harder and longer. "Hold your horses," someone called from inside. Relieved, Celeste exhaled explosively. "They're okay." The man who opened the door, evidently John Bimmer, was about 55, shiny bald on top with a Friar Tuck fringe of hair. His beer belly overhung his pants. The bags under his eyes, his drooping jowls, and his rubbery features made him appear as friendly and comfortable as an old hound dog. "You're an impatient young fella, ain't you?" he said affably. Then he spotted Celeste and broke into a wide smile. "Hey, missy, that lemon meringue pie you brought by yesterday was every bit of a first-rate job." Celeste said, "Mr. Bimmer, we—" "First-rate?" he repeated, interrupting her. He was wearing an unbuttoned flannel shirt, a white T-shirt, and tan pants held up by suspenders, and he patted the bulge of his belly to emphasize how good the pie had been. "Why, I even let Beth and Ma take a smell of that beauty before I ate it all myself." The night echoed with a hard crack, as if the wind had snapped off a big tree branch somewhere nearby, but it was not a branch and had nothing to do with the wind, because simultaneously with the sound, arterial blood brightened the front of John Bimmer's T-shirt. His engaging smile turned strange as he was half lifted off his feet and thrown backward by the power of the shot. Joey shoved Celeste through the open doorway into the living room floor. He scrambled after her, dropped beside her, rolled onto his back, and kicked the front door shut hard enough to rattle a pair of pictures. John Kennedy, Pope John 23, and a bronze crucifix on the wall above the sofa. Bimmer had been thrown backward with such force that he wasn't even lying in their way, which meant that the caliber of the weapon was big, damn big, a deer rifle, maybe even bigger than that, a lot of punch. Probably hollow point cartridges, too. In a blue bathrobe and a crown of pink hair curlers, Bimmer's wife rose from an armchair in front of the television, even as the door was slamming shut, stunned into silence, but only for an instant. When she saw her husband's vest of blood and the two shotguns, she reached the logical but incorrect conclusion. Screaming, she turned away from them. "Get down!" Joey shouted, and Celeste cried out, "Beth, stay down!" Unheeding, in a blind panic, heading toward the back of the house, Beth Bimmer crossed in front of a window. It imploded with an incongruously merry, bell-like ringing of shattering glass. She took a shot in the temple, which snapped her head to the side so hard that it might also have broken her neck. And as the phantom audience on the television laughed uproariously, she crashed to the living room floor in front of a bird-like elderly woman in a yellow sweatsuit who was sitting on the sofa. The older woman had to be Hannah, Bimmer's mother. But she had no time to grieve for her son and daughter-in-law, because 2 of the next 3 shots were generous destiny's gifts for her, pumped through the same window but delivered without the merry bell music of breaking glass, killing her where she sat as she reached for her hickory cane with one palsied hand, before either Joey or Celeste could even cry out to her. It was late October of 1975, and the Vietnam War had ended back in April, but Joey felt as if he were in one of those Asian battle zones that had filled the television news when he'd been growing up. The sudden, senseless death might have shocked him into immobility and fatal indecision, except that he was actually a 40-year-old man in a 20-year-old body, and those additional 20 years of experience had been gained during a time when sudden, senseless violence had grown commonplace. As a product of the latter decades of the millennium, he could cope reasonably well in the midst of gunfire and random slaughter. The living room was filled with light, making easy targets of him and Celeste, so he rolled onto his side and fired the 20-gauge Remington at a brass floor lamp with a fringed shade. The roar of the shotgun in that confined space was deafening, but he pumped a fresh shell into the breech and fired at one of the end table lamps flanking the sofa, then pumped it again and took out the lamp on the other end table. Understanding Joey's intent, Celeste fired 1 round into the television screen, silencing the sitcom. The burnt powder stench of gunfire was immediately overlaid with the hot, astringent odor of ruined electronics. "Stay low, under the windows," Joey instructed. In the ear-stunning aftermath of the shotgun fire, he sounded as though he were speaking through a woolen winter scarf, but even though his voice was muffled, he could hear the tremor of fear in it. He was a child of the pre-millennium follies, steeled to the savagery of his fellow human beings, but he nevertheless felt as though he might wet his pants. Follow the walls to a doorway, any doorway, just get out of the room. Crawling frantically along the floor in the darkness, dragging the shotgun by its strap, Joey wondered what role he was supposed to serve in his brother's nightmare tableau. If Celeste's parents returned to town and stepped into PJ's gun sights, locals would provide all 12 bodies needed for the creation of his demented bit of theater. But he must have a use in mind for Joey, too. After all, he had raced to catch up with the Mustang on the county route, swung onto Coal Valley Road, and paused tauntingly, daring Joey to follow. Although he perpetrated atrocities that any normal person would call acts of madness, PJ didn't otherwise behave irrationally. Even within his homicidal fantasies, he operated with an appreciation for structure and purpose, however grotesque they might be.